Hi, everybody. Great to be with you today. My name is Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. And you may know this person, Tai Lopez, one of the first viral internet marketers whose video Here in My Garage has become a meme. If you've never seen it, you should take a look. 7 years ago, 71 million views. Tai Lopez, Here in My Garage, a very famous YouTube ad. Well, I heard about this guy, Tai Lopez, as I was trying to build Millerman School, looking at some resources in sales and marketing. And one of the copywriters I was watching, he said, this guy's the OG internet copywriter. So fast forward a little bit later, and a couple of weeks ago, this Iced Coffee Hour, a podcast with entrepreneurs, business people, they had this come up, the rise and fall of Tai Lopez Here in My Garage. So I hadn't seen his name in a long time, and I thought that I would listen to that interview. It's pretty interesting. He's a great storyteller. It sounds like he's had a pretty wild life. And whenever I hear entrepreneurs and business people, venture capitalists, startup guys, and all of that talk about philosophy, it always intrigues me. You know, that people who are in the field making money, when they start to think about what it means to be happy and what it means to live a meaningful life and what the limitations are of striving, they have to have recourse to the philosophers because those are the ones who expressed that in the best way. So I found it interesting that in this interview, The Rise and Fall of Tai Lopez, he mentioned Aristotle, he mentioned Plato, but in particular, towards the end of the interview, he's asked what books he would recommend to people. And you can see here that he even has on his site, tailopez.com/books, he has a list of recommended books. And he didn't mention I don't think he mentioned the Peter Drucker. He did mention this David Buss, but what I was kind of surprised by, and I thought we could use his interview as an occasion to discuss, is this book, Civilization and Its Discontents by Freud. Because Tai Lopez says at the end of this interview here with the Iced Coffee Hour, right at the end, I don't know if I play whether you'll hear the system audio or not. Let's not do it anyway because we don't want to sit through the advertisements, which normally I don't have, but I'm using incognito just to make it easier here. Well, okay, so Civilization and Its Discontents, he said in particular, the second section of that book, he said, read that. Those few 10 pages are the most profound statement of the human condition, something along those lines, that you'll find anywhere. So I thought we could use the occasion of Tai Lopez's recent interview to look at what Freud says in Civilization and Its Discontents. But I wanted to show you my nice Millerman School Lamborghini. I've never seen that one before. So you see things are moving quite well in the school. Nice to be with you, Christopher, and everybody else who's here. Here's the book, Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. So what did Tai Lopez learn reading Freud? Why does he recommend this near the top of his recommended book list? Why did he mention the second part of this book in his recent interview as such an important and compact statement about the human condition? What does it tell us about life in general? What can be applied to understanding internet marketing and things like that? On the other hand, here we go. Let's jump into the Freud. You see how we're doing it? So even though he said, let's focus on the second part of the book, there's a little bit of preliminary stuff that we should do first. So Freud is addressing the question of the origin of religious thought, or as he puts it here, the feeling that lies at the basis of the source of religious energy. Okay, so actually the early context of Civilization and Its Discontents is this dispute that Freud is having with his friend about the origin of religious thought and the origin of religious feeling. So what his friend says is that at the origin of religious feeling is this kind of oceanic sense of oneness with the world. Those of you who read mysticism or who have experienced something like the feeling of a union with the world, if you have ever been walking through a beautiful park, maybe you've experienced union with the natural world around you. Maybe if you've been in a contemplative mood, you've experienced union with all times, past, present, and future. Maybe you've had some sense of this oceanic, limitless, unbounded sensation of eternity. which Freud's friend thinks lies at the basis of the religious experience. As he puts it, this feeling, Freud here summarizing his friend's position, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. It brings with it no assurance of personal immortality, but it is the source of the religious energy which is seized upon by the various churches and religious systems, which then direct it into particular areas. So Freud says, by contrast, that he cannot find this oceanic feeling in himself. And so he tries to understand, what is my friend talking about when he mentions the oceanic feeling as the source of religious energy? And is that actually what it is? So he says that no, there is no common to mankind oceanic feeling. Rather, it's kind of a throwback to an early childhood experience. And some people have preserved the memory of that childhood experience and other people haven't. But it's no proof of a common religious sentiment among mankind. So the reason I want to walk you through the early part of Freud's argument here is because it'll help us to see more clearly the case he makes in section 2 of Civilization and Its Discontents, the one that Tai Lopez pointed to as his most profound reading recommendation for people who are trying to understand the human condition and maybe who are trying to improve as well their marketing, their copywriting, and their understanding of the pains and pleasures that move us in our lives and in our decision making. So Freud here says, from my own experience, I could not convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling. He says a sense of union is more likely to be an intellectual comprehension anyways, rather than a feeling or rather than an emotion. But what he says when he tries to derive it is the following, that we have a distinction between our ego and the external world, between ourselves and the world that we confront. And the feeling of ourselves, the sense of our ego, of our individual self, that sense, it can be disturbed and it develops. And when we put these two things together, that the ego develops and that it can go through certain phases of disturbance, that's going to allow Freud to derive that oceanic feeling and in a sense to dismiss it. So what he says is that you learn from an early childhood experience, like when you're an infant and you're suckling a breast and you're getting pleasure from it and you're getting nourishment from it, you can barely distinguish yourself from the external world. You're sort of just in a fluid connection with it. And gradually you become distinguished from it. One comes to learn a procedure, Freud writes, by which through a deliberate direction of one's sensory activities and through suitable muscular action, one can differentiate, in a way that a newborn child can't do yet, between what's internal, what belongs to the ego, and what is external, what emanates from the outer world. So you begin with this sense of an immersion that hasn't really distinguished you yet from the outside world, but gradually you do begin to make that distinction. And he says that that reality principle, the principle that there's a world out there that may not have your best interests in mind at all times, it may not be fully invested in bringing you pleasure at all times, it may bring you pain. That reality principle comes in and it dominates the future development. In order to fend off certain unpleasurable excitations arising from within, the ego can use no other methods than those which it uses against unpleasure coming from without. And that's the starting point of important pathological disturbances. So the ego learns to keep pain away in the external world. But the pains that come from within, the ego also has to develop certain mechanisms against, and it has to learn to deal with those types of pains. You see? So now we have the formation of the ego. And remember, if people like Tai Lopez, who are involved in sales and marketing and copywriting, they're hypersensitive to the human psychology. They have to be, because you have fear of missing out. You have all of the different psychological heuristics and biases that their copywriting is designed to exploit. So it's no surprise that they should have an interest in psychologists, and also no surprise in some sense that they should do their best to master psychology in order to become very persuasive. So we have these pathological disturbances of the ego as it tries to fend off painful experiences and, as again, Freud puts it here, unpleasurable excitations, both from within and from without. And his original thesis, as I say, Freud's, is that this oceanic feeling that his friend said lies at the basis of religious experience is just the sediment or the residue or the memory of the early experience where the reality principle hadn't yet chopped off our pleasant sense of oneness with the rest of the world. So, just like some of you maybe have a great memory and some of you have a poor memory, so too among human beings, Freud speculates, some people have remembered, they've left that residue or trace, and that's what accounts for the oceanic feeling. But other people, they've had it, removed over time, and so they no longer have this sense of a pleasurable all-unity memory. So this is in the first part of Civilization and Its Discontents. He examines that. And ultimately, at the end of the chapter, he says, no. We can acknowledge that there's an oceanic feeling in many people, and you can even trace it back to this early phase of the ego feeling, but you can't call it the source of religious needs because I, Freud writes, cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for, and I'm going to give you a chance here to guess if you want in the chat, not the memory of the unbounded, limitless pleasure that you get as an infant suckling the mother's breast, where there hasn't yet been the radical intrusion of the reality principle, but what might be the strongest need in childhood besides that? What strong need in childhood might lie at the basis of the religious experience? Freud says, I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. So it's the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father aroused by it that, for Freud, lies at the basis of the religious need or the religious attitude. To quote him here, the origin of the religious attitude can be traced back in clear outlines as far as the feeling of infantile helplessness. There may be something further beyond that, but it's wrapped in the present in obscurity. So no oneness with the universe. And then he does recognize that there are, as we said, mystics and romantics and other people who seem to be able to tap into the sense of unity, including people who are practitioners of yoga. So he says here, for example, a friend of mine whose insatiable craving for knowledge has led him to make the most unusual experiments and has ended by giving him encyclopedic knowledge, has assured me that through the practice of yoga, by withdrawing from the world, by fixing the attention on bodily functions, your breath and navel gazing, and by peculiar methods of breathing, one can in fact evoke new sensations in oneself, which he regards as regressions to primordial states of mind, which have long been overlaid. Okay, so his friend finds in yoga a physiological basis of much of the wisdom of mysticism. But Freud says those speculations are too ethereal for me. Freud's going to give another kind of explanation. So that's a little bit of the background as we get to section 2 of Civilization and Its Discontents, which is the part that Tai Lopez in a recent interview said you should read if you want a kind of, in his opinion, a distilled wisdom concerning the state of the human soul and the human condition. So let's now turn to section 2, and let me just welcome those of you who are here. It's always a pleasure to spend my time together with you. You may know here again, if you've never seen this ad, a famous copywriting hit here, Tai Lopez here in my garage. He said in that recent interview that he's made tens of millions of dollars off the product that was linked to this 4-minute advertisement. 4-minute YouTube video linked to a longer sales video for a course on 67 steps or something like that. He says made tens of millions of dollars on that advertisement. Okay, so I don't claim that people who make tens of millions of dollars are necessarily wiser or better or happier or anything like that. But you have to admit they probably know something that we don't know if they managed to do something that everybody kind of wants to do, make more money. So if they've cracked some sort of psychological code there, I don't think that's trivial. And when if you watch this interview, The Rise and Fall of Tai Lopez here in my garage with the iced coffee hour, it's a good discussion. He seems like someone who really loves knowledge, if you don't mind my reference to the here in my garage ad. So because he had recommended so strongly, as you see here, Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, I thought we would take the occasion to go over it. And we turn now to the second part of it. So first of all, Freud begins the chapter by dismissing the common opinion about religion. Let me just read that to you. I wouldn't say this is the part that jumps out in connection to Tai Lopez and copywriting and sales and marketing, but it's the context that Freud provides. So let's hear it. In my future of an illusion, I was concerned much less with the deepest sources of the religious feeling than with what the common man understands by his religion, with the system of doctrines and promises which, on the one hand, explains to him the riddles of this world with enviable completeness, who we are, where we came from, what the world is, why it's there, where it's going, and all of that. And on the other, assures him that a careful providence will watch over his life and will compensate him in a future existence for any frustrations he suffers here. The common man cannot imagine this providence otherwise than in the figure of an enormously exalted father. You see the connection with what we just read, right? The greatest source of the religious need for Freud is the need for the father's protection. Only such a being can understand the needs of the children of men and be softened by their prayers and placated by the signs of their remorse. The whole thing is so patently infantile, Freud writes, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it's painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. So you could say initially you have this puzzle set out by Freud. The source of the religious feeling is not this oceanic oneness, but rather the need for the Father. It culminates in this teaching about providence. And unfortunately, that teaching, if you believe Freud's reasoning here, if we just enter into it, it's quote unquote patently infantile. So how does that happen? How do humans construct for themselves? I'm not telling you this is my view. We're discussing Freud. How do humans construct for themselves, and why do they construct for themselves a patently infantile view foreign to reality? So this foreignness to reality and the way that we respond to reality becomes the all-important theme here in section 2. So, first of all, the world is rough. The world is not constantly concerned about making us feel good. The world is hard. It brings pain, disappointment, loss, suffering, and all of that. And in the face of pain, disappointment, loss, and suffering, we cannot dispense, as Freud puts it, with palliative measures. So there are perhaps 3 such measures. What are they? Number 1, powerful deflections which cause us to make light of our misery. We deflect the misery, we deflect the pain, we make light of it. Secondly, substitutions. So one way that we deal with our pain is by making light of it. Another way is that we substitute a different satisfaction, which diminishes it, and also intoxicating substances. Okay, so let me just repeat that. How do we deal with the fact that the world is hard with pain and disappointment? We have deflections, substitutions, and intoxications. Now, I should tell you that Freud had this quote by a German poet, Goethe, and the quote is as follows. Again, thinking here about religion as a sort of palliative. Goethe writes, "He who possesses science and art also has religion. But he who possesses neither of those two, neither science nor art, let him have religion." So Goethe is saying religion is a helpful thing to have. People who don't have it, especially if they also don't have science and art, if they don't have knowledge and beauty, all the more so do they need religion. And Freud says, listen, I am not somebody who thinks that religion is particularly helpful. I think it's a sort of illusion. And therefore, I'm going to depart from Goethe's opinion and try to show you the origin of this faulty opinion. So why do I tell you that? Because we have the 3 ways of avoiding the misery of the world: deflection, substitution, and intoxication. And he says science is a deflection. Scientific activity, like cultivating your garden, is a deflection from the pain and misery of the world. Art is a substitution. Because art, for example, offers illusions in contrast with reality, illusions that are psychically effective because of the role that the imagination has assumed in life. So art does do something to get us away from the pain of the world, as we'll see. And intoxication also alters our chemistry. It seems to increase some pleasures and decrease some pains. Incidentally, you must at some point read The Laws of Plato, which deals with the socially significant role of intoxication for the legislator, because he uses well-constructed drinking parties to see how people react to pleasure in a controlled environment. But never mind that. So the question is, which of these is religion? Is religion a deflection? Is religion a substitution? Or is religion an intoxication? Freud wants to know. And he first begins by raising the following a set of reflections. The question of the purpose of human life. Let's go right to the money shot. What's the meaning of human life? What's the purpose of human life? Why are we here? How should we live? What do we do? The question of the purpose of human life has been raised countless times. It has never yet received a satisfactory answer, and perhaps does not admit of one. Religion alone can answer the question of the purpose of life, because religion has a sense of where we came from, where we are, and where we're going in a large, meaningful scheme. But Freud can't go there because, as you see, he's trying to get us to a root of the religious illusion. So instead, he says, look, although you could conclude that the idea of life having a purpose stands and falls with the religious system, let's turn instead to what can we infer from people's behavior about what they regard as important. So maybe they have an answer to the question of the meaning of life that they get from religion, but how do they live? What does their life tell us is important to them? So here's how he puts it. We will therefore turn to the less ambitious question of what men themselves show by their behavior to be the purpose and intention of their lives. What do they demand of life and wish to achieve in it? And here, everybody's eternal promise, if you're a copywriter or in sales and marketing, if you're Mr. Tai Lopez or Brunson or any of those other copywriting OGs, the answer to this claim can hardly be in doubt. They strive after, well, what does everybody strive after? Even Aristotle has an answer to this question. Maybe not what's the purpose of life, but what does everybody seemingly strive after? They strive, Freud writes, after happiness. They want to become happy and to remain so. By the way, in the comments, I'm glad you guys like the thumbnail. That's my brand new Lambo over in the, over in my other office. And glad you like the title too. So people want happiness. They strive after happiness. They want to become happy and to remain so. And there are two sides, straightforward. Classical philosophy, I think, gives you a more nuanced perspective of this particular question, but, a large set of commonalities here. The being happy, Freud takes as his analysis here, has two sides, positive and negative, an absence of pain and unpleasure, and the experiencing of strong feelings of pleasure. Up the volume on the pleasure, turn down the volume on the pain. Okay? More of one, less of the other. Pains and pleasures. Very simple. In its narrow sense, the word happiness relates only to strong feelings of pleasure. But in its broader sense for Freud, it also means not just increasing our pleasures, but decreasing our pains. In conformity with this dichotomy in his aims, man's activity develops in two directions, either increasing the pleasure or decreasing the pain, and that's what we're going to see in a second. Now, again, we're asking the question, what did Tai Lopez learn from Freud? This is one of his most recommended books, number 3 on his list, if you go to tailopez.com/books. And it's also the one that he mentioned intriguingly to me, why I decided to make this video, at the end of his recent interview on the Iced Coffee Hour podcast. So I think we're getting close to it here, because if you're doing sales and marketing and you're thinking about the human condition and you have Freud come along and talk to you about everybody wants happiness, happiness means seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. How do you help people in your copywriting seek pleasure and avoid pain? So let's see what Dr. Freud has to say. As we see, what decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. But you can't just run your whole life seeking for pleasure, because there's no possibility of this program being carried through. Quote, all the regulations of the universe run counter to it. Okay, even if you're able to derive pleasure, we're made in a way that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. So you like the feeling of going from less to more, from hungry to eating, from thirsty to drinking, from sexual appetite to sexual fulfillment. Okay, a state change is pleasant, But if you were constantly sated, the sense of your pleasure goes down if your pleasure is felt in contrast. You see what I'm saying? So that's what Freud mentions here. And that means you can't always be in a state of happiness. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so as Chris writes, you got to amplify the pain first. You need to know in copywriting, sales, and marketing, what's the pain that they're dealing with? You have to focus on the state change. I sell something very niche, courses on abstract philosophers and Plato, Aristotle, Heidegger, Nietzsche. But even so, you've read Heidegger 5 times and you've been banging your head against the wall because you don't understand it. You feel like you'll never understand it. That's pain. Anyway, let's go back to the Freud here. So we're threatened from suffering from 3 directions. So you're not going to have just a flat line of pleasure because a flat line isn't pleasant. So that's number 1. And number 2, even if you thought it was pleasant, it's very difficult to achieve because we're threatened from 3 directions. From our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution, and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety as warning signals. So all of the body-based copywriting, is there. The pains of the body, health, well-being, longevity, sickness, disease. We're threatened with suffering from 3 directions. From our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution. Next, from the external world, which may rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction. You can't control and conquer the external world. It's there to inflict its suffering on you. I drove 2 days ago from Montreal to Toronto, and I'm sure that many of you experienced a large winter storm in the last couple of days. Well, we counted on the way from Montreal to Toronto 50 cars in the ditch by the highway. 50. Some tractor trailers, cars turned over, and there were many accidents that we didn't see and many cars that we didn't count. Why? Because the external world raged against the drivers with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction called a snowstorm, a blizzard, winter. So suffering comes to you from the body. Suffering comes to you from the external world. And finally, Freud writes, suffering comes to us from relations to other people. The suffering which comes from this source is perhaps more painful to us than any other. Not being recognized, not being admired, not being reciprocated, not being respected, no dignity afforded to you. All of that. The pain that comes from relations to other people. Extremely, extremely painful. So he continues, it's no wonder if under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, men are accustomed to moderate their claims to happiness. So the first claim, I want total happiness, according to Freud's presentation here, that consists in pleasure, maybe uninterrupted pleasure with no pain. But because the world makes me suffer, because people make me suffer, and because my body makes me suffer, I should curb my enthusiasm, lower my expectations, and aim lower. People moderate their expectations, and they try to avert their suffering. Now, they can avert their suffering in many ways, and what I think Freud insightfully says here is that the many ways that people can try to increase their pleasure and decrease their pains, and in particular, the many ways in which they can try to avert suffering, all these paths have been recommended by the various schools of worldly wisdom and put into practice by men. In other words, many different schools. The Stoics give you some advice on how to avoid suffering. Buddhists give you some advice on how to avoid suffering. Christians give you some advice on how to avoid suffering. Because it's a common human task if you think that happiness consists of just that. So he says, he goes through some of these methods of averting suffering, and that ends up forming the basis of this second part of civilization and its discontent. So I want to go over some of what he says about how you can do that. Because again, what did Tai Lopez learn reading Freud? Among other things, he learned that we want happiness, that we want to avoid pain, that we want to seek pleasure, that you can't just seek pleasure unless somehow it's a response to pain and to try to lower the pain. And here are the various ways in which people have done that and in which it can be done. So the crudest but most effective among the methods is intoxication. Intoxication. You can take a drug, you can smoke up, you can do what you need to do to numb or dull the pain. Not a recommendation, obviously. I'm reading through what Freud writes about the ways in which people have tried to dull their pain. So he says it's kind of interesting. And incidentally, you'll see he thinks religion has something of this intoxicating character to it. And again, you should know the importance of some forms of intoxication, like wine drinking, in the history of political philosophy. Okay, Rousseau writes about wine drinking parties in his Politics and the Arts. Plato, as I always like to mention, writes about it in the Laws. So it's not just like, some people get drunk and do drugs in order to avoid their pain. There's more to the story than that, but that's certainly part of the story. Next, controlling your instincts, suppressing your pleasure, right? Mastering your desires. For example, as Freud writes, as practiced by yoga. Killing off the instincts, as he puts it. If this succeeds, the subject has, it is true, given up all other activities as well. He's sacrificed his life. And by another path, he has once more only achieved the happiness of quietness. We follow the same path when our aims are less extreme and we merely attempt to control our instinctual life. Then you're controlling your lower self with your higher self. And the higher self is sort of the reality principle, and the lower self is the pleasure-seeking principle. Okay, so you're differentiated in that way. And Freud says, look, not that there's anything wrong with that, okay, but you have to acknowledge that there's an undeniable diminution, lessening of the potentialities of enjoyment. So when you control your instincts, yes, you may be able to navigate reality somehow in a more steady way. But the feeling of happiness derived from the satisfaction of a wild, instinctual impulse, untamed by the ego, is incomparably more intense than that derived from sating an instinct that has been tamed. The irresistibility of perverse instincts, and perhaps the attraction in general of forbidden things, finds an economic explanation here. So as you tame your instincts, you derive less satisfaction from them. And you derive more satisfaction from the prohibited instincts, from the wild instinctual impulses, from sating them. So maybe something in the copywriting about about what's anything that's secret, anything that's forbidden, anything that's hidden, anything that the reality principle has tried to tame. You say, here's the untamed, wild, uncontrolled version of it. Okay? Once again, he says it's undeniable. It's undeniable that the feeling of happiness derived from the satisfaction of wild instinctual impulses untamed by the ego are incomparably more intense than those that take place under the tamed instincts. I don't remember who said it, probably some anarchist. I'm not condoning it, but I heard somewhere this phrase, stolen watermelon tastes better. That's the basic idea. Okay, why does stolen watermelon taste better? Because you have the joy of the theft, the joy of the transgression. And again, you may know from Aquinas. Aquinas' Confessions, where he discussed the thrill of stealing a pear from a pear tree. Why was that? It's not like I didn't have enough pears. Where did I get that thrill from? So in general, this thrill of transgressing what's permissible, the thrill of the forbidden. Okay, that's a big thing here. So that's one way that you can try to deal with the pain of the world, is by controlling your instincts, but everybody knows that somehow you're depriving yourself of some serious pleasure that way too. Another technique for fending off suffering is the employment of the displacements of libido, which our mental apparatus permits of. If you've ever seen the Seinfeld episode where George Costanza stops having sex and suddenly he becomes a bit of a genius, okay, he's like solving Rubik's Cubes in 30 seconds and he's like, just becomes a genius, right? Because all of his sexual libidinal energy has been channeled into his mental and psychical apparatus. And then he has sex and becomes George again. So here you have the idea that you can fight against the pain of the world by displacing your libido into the mental apparatus, into intellectual activity. And he says that one gains the most from this if one can sufficiently heighten the yield of pleasure from the sources of psychical and intellectual work. And then fate can do little against one. So you can steel yourself against fate by loving knowledge, okay, by doing the good work of studying and writing and thinking and creating intellectually. You've really sublimated all of that libidinal energy into your psychic and mental work. And Here, Freud, being something of, I guess, a realist in these respects, he says, at present, we can say figuratively that such satisfactions seem finer and higher. Like it's somehow seems finer and higher to channel your libidinal energy into writing a poem than it does to go expend of it in some other way. But their intensity, the intensity of these mental intellectual pleasures, is mild as compared with that deriving from the sating of crude and primary instinctual impulses. It does not convulse our physical being. So he says, look, there's a sense in which we talk about the intellectual work as a good way of fending off fate and channeling your libidinal energy into these acts of psychic and mental and intellectual creation. But look, if you've had an orgasm before, then you know that writing a good poem is not really like having an orgasm. There's some sort of similarity. Yeah, you can poetically this and metaphorically that. But, quoting again, it does not convulse our physical being, Freud writes. And the weak point of this method, the weak point of the method of dealing with the disaster of the world by channeling all your energy into intellectual activity, is that it's not applicable generally. It's accessible to only a few people. It presupposes the possession of special dispositions and gifts, which are far from being common to any practical degree. You can't expect everybody to become a philosopher or a scientist or a poet or a researcher. So it's not applicable on a broad scale, and on a short scale, it's also not as pleasant as the real thing. It creates no impenetrable armor against the arrows of fortune, and it habitually fails when the source of suffering is a person's own body. So imagine, like, you have some sort of bodily frailty or impairment, then you can't really rely on that. So the next way he says that people try to make themselves independent of the external world and of its pains and slings of fortune and all of that is through illusion, imagination, deception somehow. Okay. So he says, satisfaction in some cases is obtained from illusions, which are recognized as such, without the discrepancy between them and reality being allowed to interfere with enjoyment. You know it's imaginary and you still enjoy it. So it was designed from the outset not to be real. You haven't collapsed the reality principle into thinking that the imagined thing is real. No, you take pleasure in what you know is imaginary. The region from which these illusions arise is the life of the imagination. At the time when the development of the sense of reality took place, this region, the realm of the imagination, was expressly exempted from the demands of reality testing and was set apart for the purpose of fulfilling wishes which were difficult to carry out. Okay, so some people take refuge in the realm of the imagination. But the mild narcosis induced in us by art, which would be an expression of what you can produce from the realm of imagination, it can do no more than bring about a transient withdrawal from the pressure of vital needs, and it's not strong enough to make us forget real misery. Yes, on one hand, there's the story of someone like Bill Murray who was suicidal and on his way to the bridge that he was going to throw himself off of, decided spontaneously or providentially to walk into an art gallery. He saw a painting. This painting gave him a new resolve to live. And voila, art saved him from despair and it saved him from suicide. So are there some cases where art can be redeeming so much so that they save a man's life? Apparently. But nevertheless, it's not strong enough to make us forget real misery. And just because he's alive doesn't mean he never experiences pain, suffering, and everything that Freud here is discussing in relationship to our pleasure and our pain. Another procedure for avoiding the pains of the world, becoming a hermit, turning your back on the world, not dealing with it at all. He says that won't work, okay? These people become madmen and they find no one to help them carry out their delusion. Now listen to this, because you remember the first part of the conversation, right? The origin of the religious attitude. Is it this oceanic feeling? He said, no, it's the need for the missing father. Becomes infantile. It's a very infantile attitude towards the world. Well, here he brings it up again. Listen, it's asserted that each one of us behaves in some respect like a paranoiac, corrects some aspect of the world which is unbearable to him by the construction of a wish, and introduces this delusion into reality. Okay, so everybody's constantly deluding themselves about reality. A special importance attaches to the case in which this attempt to procure certainty of happiness and a protection against suffering through a delusional remolding of reality is made by a considerable number of people in common. Mass psychosis type thing. The religions of mankind, Freud says, sorry to say, religions of mankind must be classed among the mass delusions of this kind. Okay, so on one hand, the context of the discussion so far is religion. But in the course of trying to understand religion as a delusion, Freud is giving us some insight into people's pleasures and pains, what we seek, what we avoid, and how you can pull on the strings of our pleasures and our pains to get us to do this or that, to see this or want that. Two things he mentions here towards the end of section 2 that are pretty interesting, that maybe the rest hasn't quite prepared you for. So we've had these various ways of avoiding reality, okay? Intoxication, being a hermit, okay? Imagination, illusion, intellectual work, intoxication, as I think I said, controlling the instincts. And none of them is he fully on board with. But now he mentions this one, which is nice. Here he doesn't elaborate it, but let me tell you anyways. I do not think I've made a complete enumeration of the methods by which men strive to gain happiness and keep suffering away, and I know that the material might have been differently arranged. One procedure I haven't mentioned yet, not because I've forgotten it, but because I'm going to mention it later. And how could one forget it? It's conspicuous for its strange features. It aims at making the subject independent of fate, and to that end, it locates satisfaction in internal mental processes. But it doesn't turn away from the external world. On the contrary, it clings to the object belonging to that world and obtains happiness from an emotional relationship to it. So it doesn't flee the world, it's fully in the world, and it doesn't flee itself, it's fully related to itself. I'm going to tell you in a minute what it is. You can guess in the chat if you want to. It also is characterized by a passionate striving for a positive fulfillment of happiness, not just avoiding pain and pleasure, but striving for the positive fulfillment of happiness. And perhaps Freud says it does come nearer to this goal than any other method. I am, of course, speaking of the way of life which makes blank the center of everything. Any guess? What's the way of life? What's at the center of a way of life that seeks happiness from an emotional relationship to things in the world, doesn't turn away from the world, nevertheless makes itself independent of fate, passionately strives for positive fulfillment of happiness? Four-letter word. Think Lex Friedman if it helps. Okay, the way of life which makes love the center of everything, which looks for all satisfaction in loving and being loved. He says that that's one technique for sure. But like the other techniques, it does have a weak side. The weak side of this technique of living is easy to see. Otherwise, no human being would have thought of abandoning this path to happiness for any other. It is that we're never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. Never so helplessly unhappy as when we have lost our loved object or its love. But this does not dispose of the technique of living based on the value of love as a means to happiness. So he's going to return to this topic later, but love. Okay, love somehow is the one for Freud that gets us closest to the positive fulfillment of happiness, so it seems. But that is more defenseless than any other against suffering at the same time, because if you lose a loved one, you're fully exposed, you're fully at risk when you're loving. And I should just say in passing, I mentioned to you I took a long drive recently with the 50 cars in the ditch. And one of the podcasts that I listened to was the podcaster. It's called London Real. That was the host. And the guest, I'd never heard her speak before. I'd only heard her mentioned once by Alex Hormozy. Her name is Esther Perel. Esther Perel. And I think the name of the talk was Sex and Infidelity, something like that. Maybe not. Sex and something. Okay, I don't remember. Sex and something. And you read that, she's like a couples therapist, okay? She's been practicing couples therapist for a very long time. I guess she's got some famous TED Talks. Again, she came up in this other conversation I heard. So she says, yeah, love, I'm going to read this again. It is that we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. Never so helplessly unhappy as when we've lost our loved object or its love. So the whole realm of love is a very complicated one. And Freud here wants us to recognize this complication. Well, okay, one more thing, beauty. He says maybe you find some sort of salvation in beauty. Beauty will save the world, that kind of thing. He says that we may go on to consider the interesting case in which Happiness in life is predominantly sought in the enjoyment of beauty. Wherever beauty presents itself to our senses and our judgment, the beauty of human forms and gestures, of natural objects and landscapes, and of artistic and even scientific creations, kind of ladder of love, like in Plato's Symposium. This aesthetic attitude to the goal of life offers little protection against the threat of suffering, but it can compensate for a great deal. The enjoyment of beauty has a peculiar, mildly intoxicating quality of feeling. Beauty has no obvious use, nor is there any clear cultural necessity for it, yet civilization could not do without it. So, beauty is one way in which we can overcome, potentially, the unpleasant, suffering world. So, once again, what are we doing? We're looking at Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, in particular Section 2, because Tai Lopez, one of the OG internet online marketing sensations, with his Here in My Garage ad. Let me just put that back up on screen. Here in My Garage. Recently gave this interview, which I watched and enjoyed, with the Iced Coffee Hour. And he said, which I'd never heard him say before because I didn't read his works before or know anything really in detail about him, that he highly recommends Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. I have a copy of the book, so I thought we'd look at it together. In particular, those sections that he really recommended. So now we're close to the end of what Freud has to say in this section, and I want to just read you one or two more passages and then give you a chance to discuss in the chat as you'd like. So he says the following: the program of becoming happy, which the pleasure principle imposes on us, cannot be fulfilled. Yet, we must not, indeed we cannot, give up our efforts to bring it nearer to fulfillment by some means or other. You're not going to fulfill unhappiness by getting pleasure, but nevertheless you have to try. Very different paths may be taken in that direction. And we may give priority either to the positive aspect of the aim, seek pleasure, or to the negative one, avoid unpleasure. By none of these paths can we attain all that we desire. Happiness, in the reduced sense in which we recognize it as possible, is a problem of the economics of the individual's libido. There is no golden rule which applies to everyone. Every man must find out for himself in what particular fashion he can be saved. And there's a nice footnote here I want to give you for context. This idea that everyone has to find out for himself how he can be saved is an allusion to a saying attributed by Frederick the Great, quote, "In my state, every man can be saved after his own fashion." So in this libidinal economy, everybody can find their way around this conflict between the reality principle and the pleasure principle, each in their own way. Someone is going to be yoga, someone it's going to be beauty, someone it's going to be intellectual activity, someone maybe it's going to be something completely different. And this idea, before I continue this quote, this idea that there's no golden rule which applies to everyone, it came out quite nicely, in my opinion, in this interview that Tai Lopez gave to the Iced Coffee Hour podcast, because the context there was the discussion of manosphere types. You know, that the only way to attract a beautiful woman is to act in such and such a way. Only if you're exuding machismo can you have the chance of driving around in this beautiful Lambo that I just bought and picking up gorgeous women. Tai Lopez says, no, you'd be surprised. You know, people respond differently to different personalities, and there's always going to be somebody who resonates with the way you are and the things you want. Okay, there's not a single way you can do things. He said many of the beautiful women that he's known would be turned off by somebody who exudes machismo. So here, maybe he has that in mind as well. Freud again, there's no golden rule which applies to everyone. Every man must find out for himself in what particular fashion he can be saved. What's going to help him to overcome the world out there with its slings and arrows. All kinds of different factors will operate to direct his choice. It's a question of how much real satisfaction he can expect to get from the external world. Number one, satisfaction from the external world. How far he is led to make himself independent of it. Okay, independence, sovereignty, control, master your fate. Okay, all of that. Control over the external world, satisfaction from the external world, and how much strength he feels he has for altering the world to suit his wishes. You can do it. Anything is possible. 10 steps to X and Y, 7 best ways to ABC, right? Altering the world to suit his wishes. making himself independent of the world, getting satisfaction from the world. In this, Freud continues, his psychical constitution will play a decisive part irrespective of the external circumstances. The man who's predominantly erotic will give first preference to his emotional relationships to other people. The narcissistic man, who inclines to be self-sufficient, will seek his main satisfactions in his internal mental processes. The man of action will never give up the external world on which he can try out his strength. So you also have this psychical typology, which I would imagine is very helpful to know or to have in mind if you're doing copywriting, sales, and marketing. So not only do you have what people want and what they don't want, you also have types, psychical types. One or two more phrases here. Just as a cautious businessman avoids tying up all his capital in one concern, like don't put all your eggs in one basket, so perhaps worldly wisdom will advise us not to look for the whole of our satisfaction from a single aspiration. Don't try to get all your happiness from a single venture. Not just all your income, not just all your investments, but in your libidinal economy, in the economy of your pleasure, pain, and happiness. Worldly wisdom may advise us not to look for the whole of our satisfaction from a single aspiration. Its success is never certain, for that depends on the convergence of many factors, perhaps on none more than on the capacity of the psychical constitution to adapt its function to the environment and then to exploit that environment for a yield of pleasure. Okay, a person who doesn't have the right instinctual constitution, who hasn't properly undergone the transformation and rearrangement of his libidinal components, will find it hard to obtain happiness from his external situation, especially if he's faced with some difficult tasks. Okay? There are, according to Freud, in this second chapter of Civilization and its Discontents, many paths which may lead to such happiness as is attainable by men, but none which does so for certain. So that's not the end of this book, but that is all that I wanted to share with you on this particular occasion. Maybe I'll lecture on the rest of them and put it up at millermanschool.com when I'm done driving around in my brand new red Lamborghini. So we've been discussing Tai Lopez, Lamborghini Knowledge and Books with Tai Lopez here in my garage. Very classic online video. And then more recently, this rise and fall of Tai Lopez, where I first heard him mention that he highly recommends Sigmund Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. Now, a couple of online copywriting gurus, listen, I run an online school, so I have had to take an interest recently in sales and marketing and in books that I wouldn't normally read and wasn't taught in a political science or philosophy department, where, they're not primarily interested in sales and marketing. And I wasn't in the department of psychology, okay? But this book right here, somewhere on my reading list for sure, Evolutionary Psychology, The New Science of the Mind by David Buss, highly recommended near the top of a few lists, actually, of online sales and marketing copywriter type people. So I'm kind of curious what they see in that and how that helped them to understand what people want. And it's interesting. I don't typically default to explanations from evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. If you know this channel, you know that I focus on different things as a rule, but how could we pass up this occasion to do a little Lamborghini, Tai Lopez, Sigmund Freud? I thought it was kind of fun and well worth the effort. So that's it for Civilization and its Discontents, as I say, for the purposes of this stream. If you've never heard of Tai Lopez and you're here because you know Freud or other things that I've done on this channel, check him out, see what you think. Maybe you're hostile to the whole world of online sales and marketing, which I could definitely understand. And if you do know who he is and you enjoyed this video, like, share, subscribe, post what you want to post about Freud, about psychology of copywriting and all of that. I'll just go through some of these comments. I see you guys were active in the chat while I was doing the presentation. It was totally great. That's why I do this in a live format, because it's nice that you guys can do that. So copywriting 101, mass formation psychology stuff. Definitely. Thanks about filling the gap in the market with my school. Appreciate that. The snow-driven insanity. Yeah, I'm telling you, 50 cars in the ditch. It's like, I counted 1, 2, 3 cars in the ditch driving from Montreal to Toronto. I thought, wow, that's amazing. 4 or 5 cars. Whew. By the time we got to 10, 11, 12, and we were counting, we hit 50 between Montreal and Toronto. Dangerous road conditions lately. That was so wild. Libidinal energy, very fascinating stuff, right? Is Freud right? What do you think about Freud's arguments here? Now, separate them. The religion argument you may think is completely bogus. And he's sort of admitted at the end of section 1, let me just be clear about this. At the end of section 1, you could say he politely admits that he doesn't have access to the divine wisdom of the God-drunk mystics. Okay, because as he puts it here, it would not be hard to find connections with a number of obscure modifications of mental life, such as trances and ecstasies. So the things that some of you may be interested in, right? Like the esoteric, occult, trance, ecstasy, mysticism, conversion of the soul. But he says, I am moved to explain in the words of Schiller, let him rejoice who breathes up here in the roseate light. In other words, you have your exalted peak religious experiences. I'm a humble man down here on the ground. Let me think in terms of pleasures, pains, and their frustrations. And I, politely decline to go to the top of the mountain, the top of the holy mountain with you. So, but separately from the argument about religion and whether religion is a kind of intoxication, because, when Tai Lopez recommends reading Civilization and Its Discontents, I don't know that he primarily has the dispute whether religion is based in the oceanic feeling, the remembrance of the early childhood experiences, or the absent father and the need for his protection. I think it's more what we just read here, right? What people want to be happy. They can't quite attain their happiness. There are many different ways to try to do it, and therefore many different ways to talk to them about what they need, what they're hurting from, and what they might want. In other words, a great opportunity for competent copywriting, sales and marketing, okay? Beauty is a concept that's often used to describe something that is pleasing to the senses. Yeah, there's a passage in here about that. I didn't read it, where he says that beauty and attraction are originally attributes of the sexual object. It's worth remarking that the genitals themselves, the sight of which is always exciting, are nevertheless hardly ever judged to be beautiful. The quality of beauty seems instead to attach to certain secondary sexual characters. Okay, that's Freud from the second section here where he was discussing beauty. Happiness is a feeling of contentment, joy, or pleasure that's often associated with positive life events or experiences, a subjective experience that can vary from person to person. Other kinds of commentaries about happiness, what it is and what it consists in. Pickup coaches who advise that the goal is to identify your archetype and then find the person that's attracted to that archetype. Everything else is a square peg, round hole, could be. I noticed here there was a citation to a 1931 article by Freud on libidinal types, which I kind of want to read, to tell you the truth. Haven't read it yet. Never read it before. Might do a video on that. Who knows? So Brian has spent some time in the religious space. This kind of analytical approach feels hollow. Again, I would say here that the opportunity in thinking about Freud, at least in relationship to Tai Lopez, sales, marketing, copywriting, is more to understand man's pains and pleasures than it is to try to derive the origin of the religious feeling and the origin of the religious teaching, and then to judge it as, sophisticated or infantile, all of that. I do hope that you guys enjoyed this. I know this is kind of clickbaity with the Tai Lopez and the Lamborghini and all of that, but okay, I'm allowed to experiment. I try to offer you valuable materials here. So there you go. Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud, Tai Lopez, here in my garage. Thank you to everybody who goes to millermanschool.com and who supports this channel and my work. Without you, I would never be able to afford such a beautiful red Lamborghini. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Hope you had a nice Christmas, and see you in the next video.